this war. It occurs many, many times in the preface. Be looking out for that when you read. And it includes both the war itself and his narrative of it. First of all, he says he has a statement about the war is going to show, the war itself is going to show that it was the greatest. In other words, without any help from anybody else. Simply viewing the war will convince you from the erga themselves that the war is going to be the greatest. But then after that, he switches to, as for the things that people said in the war. So there's a men here, hosa men logo epon, that is the participants in the war. There's a men there, and there's a de here, and then there's a de here, and then there's a de here. So it's confusing. Where's the contrast? What is the contrast? But I think it's pretty clear that Thucydides has a major contrast between the logo and the erga here, and that the de in between means just and. So whatever they said in words, it was difficult for me to remember precisely, but I've actually repeated it in a subjective way. On the other hand, the actions, this is a redundance, the actions of the things done, I have decided to write. So here you have eretai, speak, versus graphein, write, and you have logo versus erga, and then you have many contrasts between these two. So, and it's a somewhat artificial contrast because after all, it's all narrative, isn't it? The speeches, if somebody gives a speech during a war, that's part of the actions of the war. A speech is an action in a way. So why is he separating? You could argue that it's not a good thing to do, but he views them as separate, and he holds them to separate standards. And I think we would kind of perversely hold them to separate standards too, in that these days, what does everybody read in Thucydides? First, the speeches, right? The speeches. And in the Renaissance, the first parts of Thucydides that were published in Greek and were translated were the speeches, collections of speeches, because they constituted political oratory, and it was political oratory that was very wide-ranging and generally applicable. It had a lot of big questions that it was dealing with. And so you didn't need to know that much about the details of the Peloponnesian War to be able to read and to assimilate, and of course to imitate in your own speech making the arguments that were made. So the speeches are great, but a historian would say, any historian I'm sure of these days would say, speeches are not a separate thing. And they would also say that you don't make up a speech. If you make up a speech, you're not a historian, because you have to find out what a person actually said. And so you would want to know what a person said in public, because that was part of that person's military or political strategy and persuasive arguments. But Thucydides does not accept that, perhaps because he simply couldn't be that accurate, perhaps because he thought that was a legitimate distinction. So when it comes to the two sides of this most famous men and de contrast, I wanted to point out to you how many places there are that are parallel or antithetical. So in the logoi column, the speeches, his word for communicating them to the reader is they have been said, from lego, eretai. Whereas his word for the actions is, I have decided to write. There's still a first person there. And by the way, the first person verbs and pronouns are the major feature of this preface. They're an authorial passage. He's talking about himself all the time, making decisions. And so he chooses to express them differently, maybe artificially, I don't know. And then there's a parallelism, because the speeches are in two categories: those I heard myself, and those that I listened to other people who were reporting them from elsewhere. In other words, I wasn't there, but they were. And then for the deeds also, I either write those I witnessed myself or the ones I got from other people. So he has to have both categories for both of these. But when it comes to the speeches, he could not reproduce the absolute transcript. There was not super accurate reproduction, but rather he reproduces as they subjectively seemed to me to be most likely to have said something. So edokun emoi. Now here you have the same words, but you have the opposite negative. I reproduced the deeds with absolute accuracy, and I did not reproduce them as subjectively they seemed to me, as I thought subjectively they would have done. This is the strongest indication that there's a separation between these two, this repetition with negatives. And then you have different words for this. For the speeches, you have, first of all, you have on with a verb. This is an indirect statement you may be familiar with. Once you see an on, you know you're entering the realm of some rather complex grammatical constructions in Greek, many of which are either potential or contrary to fact. And this is particularly complicated because on is with the infinitive. It's in an impersonal accusative and infinitive, but it seems to go with a pain. And so it's either potential, as they would say, or as it's even contrary to fact, as they would have said. And then also tadeonta. Remember, we saw that tadeonta is a more neutral word for what's necessary. Kre is a moral word for what it's right to do. But this is what is objectively necessary. Malista, now this is the most controversial of all, because we're used to thinking of malista as meaning most, right? But most doesn't quite suit anything here. You can't most say something, and something can't be most necessary because it's either necessary or not necessary. But most for Thucydides with numbers means approximately, more or less. And I believe, and a number of other people believe, but obviously the way you believe about this is very strong indicator of how you take the sentence. I believe that this is also a term of subjectivity, that it means as they would have said more or less what had to be said, deonta. And that prejudges the issue, but people who say that it means exactly as they said what had to be said, they prejudge the issue too. And I think mine is more characteristic of Thucydides and of that word in general. And then also, here's another subjective, there's some objectivity here, but he tries to keep as closely as possible to the xiumpasa gnome of what was actually said. And here, the term gnome is difficult. Often in Thucydides, we jump for an English word that we use in the same kind of phrase. And so almost universally, the translation here is the general sense. But gnome in Thucydides is a technical term for the proposal or the policy that you put before an assembly for action. It's like Latin sententia. It's I move such and such. And I think that's more likely here because almost all of his speeches are about adopting this policy or that policy. They're meant to persuade people. So I think you have the general proposal or the general policy. If you want to be vague about it, you could say the thinking, the general thinking, gignosko meaning that. I think thinking covers that as well. So I would say that both of these phrases are subjective, whereas this is not. In connection with the deeds, epex elthon literally means going forth in addition. Oh, there's a Robert Caro, I don't know if you know him, the biographer of Lyndon Johnson. He has a whole documentary out about his method in doing biographies. And I think the title is Turn Every Page, which means when you have a document, make sure that you look at every single page. Don't skip over anything, don't skim. turn every page. And that's what this verb means. I think it means going the extra mile. I've followed up everything. And then he has epiponos, which we can translate painstaking, but it's even painstakingly. And then heriskata, we've seen that that's the word in the archaeology for discovery, conclusions, really trying to find out the truth. The next section is more difficult. Tome muthodes auton. By the way, another of Thucydides' favorite words is auta. Auta, which is the most nondescript pronoun you could possibly imagine. It's the neuter plural pronoun. We can't actually even reproduce it in English because we have no plural for it. Auta is it, but auta, you have to say these things, which is already a demonstrative, which is already stronger than you want. So it's a very unassuming word. It tends to get lost. You tend to overlook it, but it's a very important word because it usually has an antecedent in the neuter, and it will help you figure out his exact reference when he does that. I'm pretty sure this auton refers here to the erga. Tome muthodes auton, literally the non-mythicness of the erga will appear to be less pleasant or more not pleasant, more not pleasant. So that's a difficult term to interpret because he doesn't use mythos very much. Many people say the lack of romance, but I don't think romance is something that anybody is doing at this time. Maybe in the 19th century, you could say romance was in a history. And it's obviously not myth because he's not telling about the myths of Homer or anything like that. I prefer the avoidance of storytelling, something like that. In other words, I don't do a lot of little short stories in my narrative, and I don't tell interesting stories. But here there's a contrast between men and de. So for hearing, perhaps it will not please them, but whoever wants to sapheskopein, this is the term we've already seen in the archaeology, right? Whoever wants to gaze upon in an analytical way, to study the clarity or the coherence of the things that have happened, ton genomenon, and that's probably erga again. And then, but also both that and also ton melonton, of the things that are about to or going to once again later, in accordance with literally the human thing, or we might say humanity, in accordance with humanity, that are going to be such and similar. To those who want to study that, to study the clarity of the things that happened in the past and which are going sometime again in the course of human events to occur or to happen in a similar or approximate way, the fact that they judge them, auta again, to be useful, that is the erga, will hold sufficiently. What a terrible way of expressing yourself. What a contorted, twisted expression. So notice that this is an accusative and infinitive that is the subject of hexe. So he said, the fact that these people, posoi, the fact that those who want to do this, the fact that they krinen auta, the erga, to be ophelima, that will hexe exarchuntos, in personal echo, like kalos ekemoi, it holds well to me, or in other words, I'm good, I'm happy with it. In this word, it will be sufficient, it will hold sufficiently, that is, it will be good, and you have to understand, I think, for me. In other words, I'll be satisfied. So there's a lot of things here. First of all, what is he saying? He seems to be delimiting two kinds of readers. And one of the readers is just interested in a story. Another reader is interested in scopain, not just listening, but studying. And Why? And what are they studying? They're studying things that are going to recur. And why are they going to recur? Kata to anthropinon. Or maybe in what sphere are they? The kata could mean in what sphere are they going to recur? Or why are they going to recur? In accordance with what model? Kata can mean, in this area. It can also mean on what principle. So there's a lot that could be said about this. And this is very controversial. First of all, well, it's very interesting because the contrast here is between pleasure, aterpesteron, and usefulness, ophelima. So this is the first example I know of in literature of a principle between usefulness and pleasure. Is literature useful or is it just pleasurable? Horace talks about that. He says you have to mix the pleasure with the usefulness. So he contrasts it. It may not be pleasurable, but I think it will be good enough for me if it's useful. But then he also says something about history, about his view of history. And many people have simply rejected this. He says, is Thucydides so naive that he actually believes that there are historical cycles and the past repeats itself? Does he have that view? He doesn't seem to us to have it. He's aware of the uniqueness of historical events, and he doesn't try to reduce the events of the Peloponnesian War to pattern. He tries to analyze them, but does he really think that? Many people have tried to amend this, by the way, and I think probably you can't take it too strongly because, first of all, he says they're going to, it doesn't mean just the future, it means of certain things that are going to be in the future, and they're going to be similar and approximately the same. Paraplesios is a very precise word that he doesn't use again elsewhere, but philosophers use. So, for example, one pre-Socratic philosopher says, everything in the universe is not the same, but it is paraplesios, because he's talking about atoms. He's talking about atoms. We are all made up of atoms, and every substance in the universe is made up of atoms. So even though we're not the same, we are paraplesios. We're not the same down to every little detail or even down to major details, but in one general respect, we are the same. So it's a very cautious word for similarity. And then he also says human, later on, he will talk about human nature, anthropeia physis. And he believes that humans, given the same situations, and he says this in connection with the stasis at Corcyra in book 3, he says, given the same situations, people are going to do this again and again. And as a matter of fact, they do. That particular thing, stasis, and they do again. If you're familiar with the stasis at Corcyra, you'll think immediately of something about a decade or two ago, the genocide in what's called genocide in Rwanda, where two groups, the Tutsi and the Hutsi, slaughtered each other, egged on by ambitious politicians, and the loss of life was incredible. And Thucydides believes that. He believes that it's innately human, given this kind of provocation and this kind of political stimulus, that people will respond in that way and behave that way again. So I think he does, in some sense, think you can predict the future. So this is a difficult section too. Finally, this is difficult too. Simon Hornblower, who wrote a commentary on Thucydides, says, this is the chapter of Thucydides that embarrasses his commentators, because he says things that seem to contradict what we admire him for. First of all, he says, the Persian War was the matter of a few days. And so what he's been saying is that by lasting 10 years, the Trojan War caused a lot of problems, and they didn't finish it as quickly as they should have. Now he's going to say that what really makes the Peloponnesian War great is that it lasted 27 years. That's why it was great. And that appears to be a contradiction. And he also says that during that time, and whereas the Persian War was done in 4 different engagements, and each of them took just 1 day. And he also says that during that time, there was much suffering, both natural suffering, natural catastrophes, like earthquakes and eclipses of the sun. And Thucydides is generally dismissive of those two events. The most famous example is in the Sicilian expedition, where there's an eclipse of the moon, I believe, which causes the Athenian general Nicias to call off a military withdrawal, which would have saved the Athenian army. And Thucydides expresses this, and Thucydides knows perfectly well what causes an eclipse. And it's not a divine sign from the gods. And he's also dismissive of earthquakes, not of the damage from earthquakes. He's very, very respectful of and very much in awe of the damage that earthquakes do. And he talks about a tidal wave, and he said, it appears that tidal waves, tsunamis, are in fact always caused by earthquakes. And he puts that out there, and they're connected. So it's the damage he's aware of. But when people use an earthquake as an omen for not doing something, in other words, I'm not going to go to battle today, or I'm going to call off something I was going to do because the gods have indicated with this earthquake that they don't support it, he reports that almost mockingly. The Spartans are especially prone to do that. But here, the most earthquakes and the most eclipses that there ever were in a comparable period. First of all, I mean, the earthquakes we can't prove, but the eclipses we can prove. That's not true. There were not more eclipses during these 27 years than there were otherwise. So why is he saying that? And then he talks about suffering. He does narrate this, and he said, and many cities were captured by the barbarians, and they were also destroyed by their own citizens in civil war. And they were emptied, and there was a lot of murder, and it was because of stasis. And he thinks that's a terrible thing, but it doesn't make a war great, right? So I must admit, this is a place where I am stuck on Thucydides, although I think he's able to hold these two, like I said before, I think he's able to hold these two aspects of war together, but he's not very good at depicting suffering in a way that doesn't overdo it. He tends to be over rhetorical in dealing with suffering, like the end of the Sicilian expedition, which is so over the top that he doesn't really express himself that effectively. So this is a passage that I have trouble with, and there's an article about this, that Thucydides is able to separate these two things. Perry compares it to Virgil's Aeneid. This is why we don't know if Virgil is pro-Aeneas or anti-Aeneas, or pro-Augustus or anti-Augustus, because he's able to see the suffering, but he's also able to see the progress. And then finally, we get to the section where he talks about causes. And he says here, well, they began the war by breaking the 30 years peace. He hasn't told us yet what the 30 years peace is, by the way. It's very odd. By breaking the 30 years peace, which happened after the capture of Euboea. He hasn't told us yet anything about the capture of Euboea. They began the war because, and why they broke the peace. Why they broke the peace, I have first written their accusations and their disputes. And almost every translator will say, I have first written the causes and the reasons. And I think I've noticed Crawley does not do that. Crawley is aware that this is not the word for cause. And then you have a genitive of kind of obscure and not very common grammatical construction, a genitive infinitive absolute of purpose, so that no one may need ever seek from what thing such a great war occurred to the Greeks. And then he makes this statement, and here he's really into his almost Gorgianic mode of rhyming antithesis. For the prophesis that was alethestate, but aphanestate, for the alleged reason that was most true, but most invisible in speech, I consider the fact that the Athenians becoming great and casting fear on the Lacedaemonians, in other words, causing them to be afraid, anankasai, they necessitated, or they made inevitable, or they forced them inevitably into war. And so here he's using still another word, a prophesis. And this is a very, very elaborate thing here. Alethestate, aphanestate, exactly the same number of syllables. They rhyme, and they both begin with alpha. In the case of and he's also punning on the idea of alethes as not forgotten. That's a common etymology of alethes in Greek. It's not a true one, but that doesn't make it any less significant. So the most true reason, but the most invisible in speech. There are two possible roots for prophesis. One is from phino and one is from phemi. And here he's punning on phino because it's aphanes, and here he's punning on phemi because it's logo. That's maybe a little bit over subtle, but I wouldn't put it past him. He loves this expression so much that he just has to get it in, and it really doesn't clarify things for us at all. Because then he goes back after telling us that he's going to narrate the causes and telling us that the truest reason is one they never talked about and what it is. Then he goes back and says, but that's not the reason I'm going to go on and talk about now, is the fear of the Spartans. And why is he not going to talk about it? Evidently because no one ever talked about it. It's most invisible in speech. He can't come up with anybody who actually says that. And it is true in the rest of book 1. He can't come up with any Spartan saying, I'm afraid. Can't do that. So instead, he's going to say the itai that were estafaneron legomenai, the accusations that were spoken openly to each other were the following, haide. And notice the itai hekateron, they're the accusations of one side by the other. Hekateroi means either of two sides. So this clearly means accusation rather than cause, because you can't have a cause of either side or the other, but you can have an accusation of one side against the other very clearly. So the accusations, as a result of which, having broken the peace, they went into the war, were the following. And then, as I say, in the next section, he begins the ascendetic opening on Epidamnus. So I've kind of indicated where I think, more than indicated, I've demanded that you translate certain words in certain ways. But I don't think there's any other way to approach this. You do need to understand why people take the opposite route. And it's because they usually say, Thucydides simply can't be saying that. The Thucydides that I know and admire, and that is the result of my reading, would not have said that. He would not have said, I made up the speeches. A lot of people are very bothered by that. Come on, he doesn't make up the speeches. He's a historian. He doesn't make up the speeches. Well, he doesn't make them up entirely, he says, but yes, he does. And of course, they're all in his style too. They're all in the Thucydidean syntactical and vocabulary style. They're inimitable that way. Everybody speaks alike. And then he can't have thought that you could simply predict the future from his history. But he does, and there are hints at certain authorial passages where he says, yep, and as people are prone to do, they did this. Or he'll stop and draw a judgment. He'll draw a judgment about how the oligarchy came apart. He said, well, that's how oligarchy usually comes apart, because these people who think they're elites, well, they have more jealousy against each other than they did of the rabble before they were ruling together. But once they get together, you discover they're very difficult people to get along with. And so you get an oligarchy, and they're going to fight. They're going to fight much more than a democracy would. And eventually they're going to decide, hey, I can do better. I can either become king or I can become a leader of the democracy. So there's some generalization. I mean, there's plenty of generalizations.